She dug her grave beside her mother's with trembling hands, ready to vanish into the dirt. But a stranger stepped in, shovel in hand, and told her one thing: not yet. The sun was cruel, perched high above a land that had given up the ghost long before the girl did. Wind clawed through the chaparral, flinging dust across the two mounds of earth, one freshly covered, one only halfway dug, and between them knelt the orphan, a girl no older than 12, her face streaked with sweat and dirt and tears that had run dry too many days ago. Her hands, raw and blistered, fumbled with the shovel again. She couldn't stop now. She wouldn't. Not until she could lie down beside her mama and finally stop aching. Each scoop of earth was slower than the last. She wasn't sure how long she'd been at it. Sunrise had come and gone, and she had no way of knowing how long before dusk returned. Her lips were split, her belly empty, her dress torn from the thorn brush. But the hole was nearly ready. A little deeper, just enough to disappear. "Graves too shallow'll draw coyotes." The voice snapped through the still air like a rifle crack. The girl froze. She hadn't heard the rider approach, hadn't heard a horse, just wind and her own breathing. She turned slowly, squinting against the glare. A man stood not far off, one hand resting on a shovel of his own, the other gripping the reins of a horse the color of night rain. His clothes were worn, hat dipped low, boots dusty from miles. He didn't move closer. He just watched. The girl wiped her face with the back of her wrist and forced herself to stand. "Go on," she rasped, voice cracked and brittle. "Ain't no one here to rob." "I ain't here for robbing," he said quietly, stepping forward now. His boots made soft sounds in the dirt. "I'm here for the same reason anyone passes through this part of the territory. Lost something, maybe hoping to find something else." She stepped back, instinctively shielding the half-covered grave behind her. The man stopped a few paces away and looked down at the uneven earth, the small bundle of withered flowers pressed to the head of the first grave. "That your mama?" She nodded once. "Died yesterday." "How long she been sick?" "A while. Fever got her. I tried to find water, tried to keep her cool, weren't enough." He looked at the second hole, "And this one?" Her chin lifted. "Mine." The silence that followed was heavier than the sun overhead. The man didn't speak right away. Instead, he slowly stepped forward, drove his shovel into the earth beside hers, and leaned on it. "You dig all this yourself?" She nodded again. "Then you've done enough digging, little one." He looked at her, really looked now. "Name?" Her lips barely moved. "Etta." He removed his hat. "Name S. Silas Boone. I got land west of here. Ain't much, but the roof keeps rain off and there's stew on the fire most nights." Etta stared, eyes narrowing. "Why you tellin' me that?" "Because I don't think your mama would want you in that hole." That did it. Her knees buckled again and the shovel dropped with a thud. She didn't cry. Not really. But her face twisted like a girl who'd forgotten how to be small, who'd carried something far too heavy for far too long. Silas caught her before she fell, arms gentle but sure, the way a man handles something breakable. She didn't fight him, she had no strength left, only silence. He sat her down in the shade of a scraggly mesquite and handed her a canteen. She drank until her stomach cramped, then handed it back with trembling fingers. "What now?" she asked after a while, voice barely above a whisper. Silas looked toward the grave. "We bury her proper, say a few words, then you come with me." Etta hesitated. "You don't even know me." "I don't need to." He looked down at her, eyes the color of old ash. "I know what it means to be alone." They buried her mother together, Silas saying quiet words Etta didn't quite catch, though the way he bowed his head told her they mattered. When it was done, he carved her mother's name into a piece of cedar and planted it by the grave. Then he placed a stone at its foot. "She won't be forgotten," he promised. The wind picked up again, warm and dry. Etta didn't say anything, but when Silas offered his hand to help her onto the horse, she took it. Her limbs ached, her chest hurt, But for the first time since the fever took her mama, she didn't feel entirely invisible. They rode in silence. The desert stretched for miles in all directions, a sea of dirt and scrub and nothingness. But as they crested a small ridge, Etta saw something ahead: fences, a windmill turning slow, and the faint smell of smoke curling up into the wide blue. Home, or something like it. The ranch wasn't large, just two buildings, one with a sagging porch and another with a lean-to of tools and crates. Chickens scattered as Silas led the horse through the gate. A dog barked once, then quieted. "You hungry?" he asked as he helped her down. She nodded. Inside, the house was plain but warm. There was a stew pot on the fire, just like he said, and bread wrapped in cloth on the table. Silas filled a bowl for her and handed her a spoon. Etta ate slowly at first, then faster. She didn't speak. Neither did he. When the bowl was empty, she looked up. "Why are you being nice to me?" Silas didn't answer right away. He was looking at a photograph on the mantel, a woman, maybe, or a child. The frame was old, so was the grief in his eyes. "Because I lost someone too," he said finally. They didn't say much more that night. He showed her the small room at the end of the hall with a bed that hadn't been slept in for a long while. She curled under the quilt without changing clothes. Her body ached, her mind drifted. The morning light crept in slow, hesitant, filtering through thin curtains and laying soft gold across the wooden floorboards. Etta stirred under the covers, confusion threading her waking thoughts before the memory of yesterday caught up with her like a shadow. She sat up quick, scanning the unfamiliar room with wide eyes. The quilt had slipped off her shoulders in the night, and her bare arms prickled against the cool air. It was quiet, too quiet. Not the suffocating silence of an empty desert, but the kind that came with walls, sturdy ones, and a roof that didn't creak every time the wind sighed. For a long minute she sat still, listening. No sound of coughing, no rasp of her mother's voice, no shovel biting into earth. Just the low hum of distant wind and the faint rattle of dishes from another room. She pulled her boots on with shaking hands and stepped into the hallway. Every part of her wanted to retreat, to vanish into herself, to go back to the familiar ache of hunger and grief that didn't require trust. But something deeper kept her walking. Maybe it was the smell of something warm, eggs or cornbread, maybe. Maybe it was the faint memory of a hand helping her down from the saddle. Maybe it was that simple word, "not yet." In the kitchen, Silas was bent over the stove, sleeves rolled, whisking something in a pan with practiced hands. His shirt was patched at the elbow, and the edges of his hair curled from sleep. He looked up only once, gave her a nod, then went back to his cooking like she'd been living there all along. "Morning," he said after a pause. "Slept all right." Etta hovered in the doorway. "I guess." "Good, you're just in time. Ain't much, but it'll keep you on your feet." He motioned to the table with his chin. "Sit, eat." She obeyed, not out of politeness, but because her body was still learning it didn't have to stay tense all the time. The plate he set in front of her held scrambled eggs and 2 thick slices of toast. Butter melted down the middle like gold. She didn't speak for a while, just ate, slowly at first, then quickly, then slowly again, like her heart was trying to catch up to what her stomach had already decided. This was real. Silas poured himself coffee and sat across from her, silent save for the occasional sip. When she finally looked up, his eyes met hers, not sharp or prying, just steady. The kind of gaze that waited, not demanded. "You always help girls dig in their own graves?" she asked, half trying to sound bold, half hoping he wouldn't answer. But he didn't flinch, just set his cup down and nodded once. "Only the ones who don't belong in M." Etta stared at her plate. "I didn't think there was anyone left to tell me I did." Silas leaned back in his chair. "I ain't anyone special, just a man who saw a little girl who needed something." "What makes you think I needed anything?" He smiled, just barely. "You didn't crawl into that grave because everything was fine." The quiet stretched again, but it didn't feel heavy this time. more like something shared than something pressing. Sela stood. Finish up and meet me by the barn, got chores to do. That caught her off guard. Chores. You think food cooks itself. Chickens feed themselves. Ain't no charity here, just folks helping each other. She blinked. It wasn't cruel the way he said it, just matter of fact, like he saw her as something more than a broken thing to be pitied. She ate the rest in silence and washed her own plate. Outside, the sun was already higher than she expected. The air had that early brightness, not yet hot but on its way. Silas waited by the barn with a pitchfork and a bucket. Chickens first, he said, handing her the bucket. Water scatter the feed, make sure none are limping. I don't know how. You'll learn. And she did, slowly, awkwardly. She spilled more grain than she fed, startled every time a hen squawked too loud and tripped twice on the fence post. But Silas didn't yell. He corrected when needed, encouraged when it mattered, and by noon the tightness in her chest had begun to loosen. They moved to the garden next. Rows of withered carrots and stubborn potatoes. He showed her how to weed, how to check the soil with her fingers. You grow all your own food? She asked. Mostly. Some things I trade for when I ride into town. She stopped digging. Town. He looked at her. Yeah. Will I have to go? Not unless you want to. You're safe here, Etta. That's not gonna change. She went back to pulling weeds, but her mind spun in circles. Safe. That word didn't sit comfortably. It felt like a coat too big for her, something she wanted to believe in but didn't quite know how to wear. Later, she sat on the porch steps while Silas mended a broken bit of fence. Her hands were stained with dirt, her arms sore, her braid lopsided from a day of sun and wind. She watched the horizon, the desert stretching beyond, and wondered how something so empty could hold so much pain and yet so much quiet promise. You ever lose anyone? She asked without turning. Silas didn't stop working. Yeah. Who? He paused, hammer still in hand. Wife and a daughter long time ago. What happened? Wife took ill, daughter went with her. His voice didn't tremble, but it thinned. Nothing I did could change it. Etta's fingers curled around the hem of her dress. Then, why'd you help me? Silas stood, wiping his hands on his trousers. Because someone should have helped them. That night Etta sat in the room again, clean for the first time in days. Silas had set out a bar of lye soap and a wash basin. Her skin tingled from scrubbing, but she felt human again, or closer to it. She held a blanket in her lap, fingers twisting the edge. She prayed. Not with words, not like her mother used to, whispering hymns when the fever got bad, but with something softer, an ache, a longing, a whispered thank you that barely reached her own ears. She wasn't sure who she was thanking. God maybe, Silas maybe, both more likely. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt the knock soft on the door. You all right? He asked through the wood. Yeah, she called, just tired. He paused. We'll get you some books tomorrow, help pass the time, you like stories. I used to, she said, then softer, maybe I still do. Good night, Etta. Good night. Sleep came easier. The fear didn't vanish, but it dulled, and in its place bloomed something unfamiliar, something warm. Hope. A week passed, then two. Etta didn't count the days like she used to, scratching lines into stones or measuring meals by how many were skipped. There was enough work to fill the hours, and something about having a task, simple, steady, meaningful, wrapped itself around her spirit like twine, tugging her forward even when her mind hesitated. The chickens knew her now. They stopped scattering when she approached and even followed her sometimes like she was one of their own. Silas joked she had a farmer's touch, but she didn't know if he was teasing or sincere. Either way, it made her cheeks flush, and she found herself smiling when he said it. Not wide, not easy, but enough that it surprised even her. She still didn't talk much. Not because she didn't want to, but because too many words always felt like an invitation for things to be taken away again. Yet Silas didn't fill the space either. He let her be quiet. Let the land speak instead. On the fifth morning, a storm rolled in. Not the kind that screamed and shattered, but one that soaked the earth with quiet persistence. The porch roof creaked under the soft patter, and the fields shimmered with moisture. The barn smelled of wet hay and mule sweat. Silas let her take the day inside. He gave her a stack of books he'd brought from town. Worn spines, cracked leather, a Bible among them, but also stories, some about faraway places, others about children with dreams larger than their shoes. Etta ran her fingers over the pages, eyes wide, absorbing each word like water after thirst. By late afternoon, she was curled on the floor by the fire, reading aloud to herself in a voice she hardly recognized. Light, clear, almost childlike. The tale was of a blind prince who loved a maiden not for what she looked like, but because her laughter reminded him of sunlight. She read until her voice cracked. Silas walked in, saw her there, and didn't speak. Just placed a tin cup of tea beside her and sat across the room, polishing a saddle. But she felt the warmth of his presence. And that night, she dared to ask him something. "Did you always live out here alone?" He looked up from his work, rubbing his thumb along the leather. "Since they passed," he said, "didn't make sense to leave." "Why not?" "Because something of them stayed. The way my wife folded blankets, the way my girl laughed when she fed the calves, it's all still here. Not loud, not obvious, just here." She nodded, though grief wasn't a language she'd ever needed help understanding. "I used to think the same," she said, "about Mama. Every rock we passed, every path we walked, it all had a piece of her." Silas glanced over. "You talk about her more now." "I think she'd want me to." He nodded slowly, like that mattered to him. That night she brought out her mother's scarf, faded pink, fraying at the edges. She kept it tucked in her satchel, folded between pages of a hymn book. She placed it on the small table beside her bed and stared at it for a long time. "Thank you," she whispered, not to the scarf but to the ceiling, or to heaven, or maybe to both. In the days that followed, a shift took place. Small, almost imperceptible, but there. Silas started leaving chores for her to handle alone, trusting her judgment. She began leaving her door slightly ajar at night, no longer locking the latch out of fear. They shared meals now without the awkward silence. She started asking about his crops. He started asking about the books she read. And when she smiled, he smiled too, like the house remembered how to echo joy. One evening, he returned from town with a wrapped parcel. "What's that?" she asked, wiping flour from her hands. "Something I figured you'd like." He handed it to her without fanfare. Inside was a small journal with an inkwell and a quill. Etta stared at it, mouth parted. "I didn't," she began. "Figure it's time you write your own stories," Silas said, sipping his coffee. That night she didn't sleep, not from fear or discomfort, but because for the first time in years her fingers ached to create, not to hold on or let go. She wrote of her mother, of the days before the sickness, of the nights by the fire. She wrote of digging the grave and of Silas's voice when he said, "Not yet." She wrote of chickens and storms and warm tea, and by the time the sun bled into the sky, her pages were full. But not all stories come easy. 2 weeks later, riders came. Etta spotted the dust first, 2 figures galloping up the ridge, silhouetted by sun. She was hauling water when they appeared, and something inside her clenched. Silas stepped out onto the porch, his jaw tightening. The riders slowed as they approached. One dismounted first. A woman, tall, hat low, gun holstered. The other was a boy older than Etta, maybe 17, with a scar across his chin. "We ain't here for trouble," the woman called. Silas crossed his arms. "Then say what you came for." The woman's eyes shifted to Etta. "We're looking for a girl, blind, about 13. Name S. Etta May, that you, sweetheart." Etta froze. The name hit like a bullet. She hadn't heard it since the night her mother died. Even Silas didn't know her last name. She never told him. "I'm her cousin," the woman added. "Her Aunt S been worried sick. We came to bring her home." Silas didn't speak. He just looked at Etta. She couldn't breathe. "You got proof of that?" he asked, voice flat. The woman smiled, reaching into her coat. "Birth record right here." She held out a crumpled paper. Silas didn't move. Neither did Etta. "Where was this aunt 2 months ago?" Silas asked. "When she was alone in the dirt with no food, no coat, digging a grave with her bare hands." The woman's face didn't flinch. "Family's messy. Doesn't mean we don't try." Etta shook her head. "I don't know you." The woman's eyes narrowed. "I don't need you to know me, just need you to come." "No," Etta said, her voice shaking. The boy stepped forward, hand near his holster. Silas moved then. Slow, deliberate, he stood between Etta and them. "This land's mine, she stays if she wants." "You gonna start a fight over someone else's kid?" the woman asked. "She ain't someone else's anymore." A beat of silence. The woman sighed. "We'll be back with Law." Silas didn't blink. "Bring whoever you want, but you better come right." They rode off. The dust settled, but the peace didn't return. That night Silas cleaned his rifle. Etta stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. He nodded once. "Yes." "Then what?" "Then we don't run." She stepped inside. "You don't have to protect me, I can leave." He looked up. "You leaving?" "No." "Then I protect what's mine." She didn't argue, just sat beside him and watched as he loaded the last bullet. Outside the wind howled across the plain, but inside something steadier held firm. Etta wasn't going anywhere. By morning the dust from the riders had vanished, but their threat lingered like smoke in the air. Silas stood at the edge of the property, his boot heels dug into the porch, one hand resting near the rifle he kept propped beside the door. Etta, sitting just inside with a bowl of cold porridge untouched in her lap, listened to the silence between them. It wasn't fear she felt. It wasn't even panic. It was something heavier, something she couldn't name. Like the earth had tilted under her and she was trying to find her footing again. "What if they bring someone real?" she asked quietly. "Someone with paper and a badge." Silas's jaw tightened. He didn't answer at first. Then, without turning, he said, "Then we'll talk, but we won't fold." Etta rose and stepped out beside him. "You can't get in trouble for me." "You're not trouble," he said. "Not to me." His words shouldn't have made her eyes burn, but they did. He turned then, not to look at her, but to kneel beside the small flower bed she'd started 2 weeks earlier. It was barely more than a patch of soft dirt near the steps, but she'd planted seeds with careful fingers, and every morning she checked them, whispering prayers her mother had once murmured while tending to tomatoes. "They'll sprout soon," he said. "I hope so." Silas stood, dusting his hands. "You've made this place different, Etta." She shook her head. "No, it was already good." He looked at her, and this time she felt it, really felt it, that whatever he'd lost before, he'd started to see in her something that brought light back. By the end of the day, Silas rode into town. Not to run, not to hide, but to prepare. He spoke with the sheriff, who didn't give much more than a grunt and a nod. Said if it wasn't a legal matter, he'd stay out of it. That didn't comfort Silas, but he understood. In a place like this, justice came slow and sometimes not at all. When he returned, dusk had already painted the horizon orange and lavender. Etta was inside, patching one of his work shirts by lantern light. He paused when he saw her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." He stepped closer, took the shirt from her lap, and set it aside. Then he held out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "What is it?" "Something I saw," he said, "and thought of you." Inside was a pair of boots, soft, durable, small, her size. I don't need. I know you don't. That's not why I got 'em. She slipped them on, blinking fast to keep the tears from falling. They fit perfectly. That night Etta dreamed, not of graves or hunger or long roads, but of a warm kitchen and sunlight falling across a bed she didn't have to share with the cold. She dreamed of laughter, not hers, but someone else's, small and high, like a child. She dreamed of holding hands and not having to let go. But the next day brought more than dreams. Mid-morning, a wagon rolled up the main trail. This time there were 3 riders, the woman from before, the boy, and a third man, older, heavyset, with a star pinned to his chest. Etta stood behind the window curtain, heart pounding. Silas stepped out onto the porch. "Mr. Hayward," the man said, nodding politely. "Sheriff," Silas returned, though his tone held no warmth. "Got word from over in Pikeville. Woman there claims this girl's kin." "She's not," Silas said. "She says she is, says she's got papers. Could be forged, could be true. But the judge in town's asking the girl to come, hear it out." Etta stepped onto the porch before Silas could answer. "I'll go," she said. "No," Silas said immediately, voice sharp. But she turned to him. "It'll look worse if I hide. If I go, I can say what I know." The sheriff watched them quietly. "Won't be long, just a hearing. She speaks her piece, judge makes a call." "And if he says she goes with them?" Silas asked. The sheriff shrugged. "Then it's law." Etta looked at Silas. "Let me go, let me fight." He searched her face, then slowly nodded. The ride to town was long, but she kept her hands folded in her lap and her head high. The woman didn't speak to her. The boy stared once or twice, but she didn't meet his eyes. The courthouse was small, a single room above the saloon. The judge was a tired-looking man with ink-stained fingers and a voice that carried more weariness than authority. Etta told her story, not with drama, not with tears, just truth. She described the days after her mother's passing, the walking, the cold, the digging, Silas finding her, the kindness she'd been given. The woman claimed Etta's aunt had sent her, that they only just found out what happened, that they wanted to give her a real home. Etta asked why no one came for her at the grave, why no one came when she begged for bread. The woman didn't answer. In the end, the judge sighed. "Truth is," he said, "the law can't make up for time lost, but the girl's old enough to speak her will. If she says she's not going, then she's not." The woman started to protest, but he waved her off. Case dismissed. Outside, the sun felt hotter than usual. Silas was waiting near the hitching post, one hand resting on the reins of his mule. She ran to him, not fast, not loud, but steady, and when she reached him, she hugged him around the waist, holding tight. "You did good," he said, patting her back gently. She pulled away just enough to look up at him. "I'm not going anywhere." "I know." On the ride home, she spoke more than usual, about the hearing, about the people she saw in town, about the way her hands had stopped shaking when she took the stand. Silas listened, quiet as always. When they got back to the ranch, the chickens greeted them first, followed by a hungry goat with no manners. Etta laughed, the sound bright and real. Later that evening, after supper, Silas handed her a carved piece of wood. "What's this?" "Made it for you, it's not much." It was a small bird, smooth and rounded with delicate wings. "It's beautiful." "I figure you were always flying," he said, "even when no one saw." She turned the bird over in her hands. "Thank you." He nodded, sipping his tea. "You ever think of staying for good?" She froze, hard in her throat. "I mean," he said, clearing his throat, "as family." Etta blinked, "Like adoption." "Maybe something like that, if you wanted." She didn't answer at first, just looked at the bird in her palm. Then she set it down, reached over and wrapped her arms around him. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'd want that. Silas didn't say anything, but he held her back. In the distance, the stars blinked to life, scattered across the heavens like tiny promises. And in the quiet of that little ranch, something finally settled in her chest, a peace she hadn't felt since her mother's lullabies. She wasn't alone anymore. Winter didn't come gently that year. The skies grayed early, and the wind swept across the plains like it had a score to settle with the earth itself. The cattle huddled in tight groups, and even the barn creaked at night as though it, too, ached from the cold. But inside the ranch house, warmth had taken root. Etta stood by the kitchen window most mornings now, wrapped in a wool shawl that Silas had left out for her. She brewed tea, stoked the fire, and found herself humming old hymns without realizing. It had been only a few weeks since the judge allowed her to stay, but the way time folded here, it felt like she'd been there always. Silas didn't speak often, but he made room for her in all the right ways. He let her handle supper when she offered, let her gather eggs in the cold morning light, let her plant her little garden with garlic bulbs and dried beans. He didn't hover, he just noticed. That was the kind of man he was. But the silence between them began to shift, less like an empty hallway, more like a room holding its breath. Not awkward, not heavy, just waiting. Etta felt it, and it stirred something tender and uncertain inside her. One evening, they sat across from each other with a small table lamp casting a golden glow. She was darning one of his socks. He was reading, fingers gliding slowly over the braille lines of a worn book he'd had since before the accident. "You've lived here long?" she asked, voice low. He nodded. "Since I was 21, built most of it myself, back when my father passed." She paused, needle hovering over cloth. "You were married, weren't you?" He didn't flinch. "Once, her name was Anna." She waited, but he didn't go on. That was all he gave her. "Was she kind?" He turned the page slowly. "Too kind for this world." Silence stretched again, not painful but real. "I think about my mother all the time," Etta said, more to the room than to him. She used to say God didn't forget the ones who were quiet, that he listened most to the ones who didn't shout. Silas nodded. "Sounds like a woman who understood things." She never had much, but she never made me feel like I was missing anything." "That's a gift," he said. "Not everyone gets to feel that." Etta set the sock aside. "Do you ever wonder if you'll see again?" He turned toward her then, his eyes clouded but still gentle. "I used to pray for it every day," he said. "After the fire, I thought God might change his mind, but after a while I stopped asking. I figured if I wasn't meant to see the world, maybe I was meant to feel it in other ways." Her throat tightened. What if someone said they could help? "I'd say healing can come in ways that don't involve eyes." She looked at him, heart fluttering against her ribs. What if the person offering wasn't a doctor, but just someone who believed in miracles? Silas tilted his head slightly. "I'd say I'd believe them more than most doctors." Etta reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small vial. It was nothing much, just herbs and oil, a mix her mother had taught her to steep, to rub across closed eyes, paired with prayers whispered before dawn. She set it on the table. Silas touched the glass gently, running a thumb over it. "What's this?" "My mother S," Etta said. "She used to say it could help, not just the body but the spirit. I thought it was foolish until it helped someone once, a neighbor who had pain behind his eyes. He swore it took it away." Silas smiled softly. "You want to try it?" She hesitated. "Only if you let me pray while I do." "I don't mind prayer," he said, "as long as it's real." That night by the fire, Etta dipped her fingers in the mixture and gently touched it to his eyelids. Her hands trembled slightly, but she whispered the words her mother once spoke, asking not for a miracle, but for mercy, for light in any form it chose to come. When she finished, Silas didn't speak. He simply sat, eyes closed, breathing steady. They waited. Nothing changed, not immediately. But something did shift between them. The room felt closer, warmer, like hope had climbed through the cracks of the walls and decided to stay the night. The next morning, Silas blinked against the sunrise. Not fully, not clearly. But light. Shapes. Shadows. He sat up slowly, and the world spun in a way it hadn't in years. Etta was already outside feeding the hens. When he stepped out, she turned. "Silas?" she asked. He didn't answer with words. He walked toward her, stopped a few feet away and just looked. "I can see you," he whispered. She froze. "What?" He reached out, brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. "Not clearly, but enough, your shape, the way the light moves around you." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't understand," she said. "It shouldn't have worked, it never." "It did," he said. "Maybe not fully, but enough." She covered her mouth with one hand. "I'm sorry," she said, suddenly unsure. "Don't be," he smiled. "It's the first sunrise I've seen in 8 years, and it's beautiful." They stood there in the cold light, neither knowing what to say next, but neither needing to. Later that day, Silas rode into town with her beside him. Not for a hearing, not for supplies. Just to walk the streets, see the world again, even if just in blurs and color. They stopped at the tailor, the bakery, and the chapel. Silas paused at the chapel steps, hat in hand. "I haven't gone inside in a long time," he admitted. "Want to?" He nodded. They sat in the back pew. Etta clasped her hands, head bowed. Silas sat quiet, listening to the old creak of the wooden beams, the wind outside pressing against stained glass. "Do you still pray?" she asked. "Every morning," he said, "even if I don't know what to say." She smiled. "That counts." He looked over at her, a little clearer now, a little less in shadow. "Etta," he said, "if I were younger or stronger, I'd ask you to stay here, not just as a guest." She looked down. "I'm not strong," she said, "and I'm not looking for someone perfect. I'm looking for someone honest." He reached over and took her hand. "I'm asking now." She blinked fast, but the tears came anyway. "I'd stay," she said, "even if you couldn't see, even if nothing else changed." "I think everything already has." They walked back through the snow together, her hand in his. Two lives once broken, now slowly mending under the same sky. The ranch stood waiting. The chickens clucked like nothing had happened. But everything had. The days that followed blurred into one long stretch of warmth wrapped in cold air. Snow came again, thicker this time, but it didn't feel like a curse anymore. Not with laughter echoing through the house, not with the quiet comfort of company. Not with Silas slowly seeing the world again, even if it was only shadows and light and pieces of faces. He didn't ask her to explain how the healing had begun, if it was the oil, the prayer, or just time finally softening its grip. He didn't need to understand it. He just accepted it. And Etta, for the first time in years, found herself resting without fear. The ranch, once still and sorrowful, stirred in little ways. Etta filled the pantry with jars of pickled vegetables and dried herbs she'd bundled herself. She mended the curtains and baked in the afternoons. She read to Silas in the evenings, and he'd sit beside her, sometimes nodding along, sometimes just listening to the sound of her voice as though it were a song. One night, during a storm that lashed against the windows and made the house groan in its bones, Etta woke with a start. A sound, faint but unmistakable. A child crying. But not inside. She threw on her coat, boots half-laced, and stepped out into the snow. The wind bit her cheeks as she followed the sound, heart pounding. Silas wasn't far behind her, moving carefully, coat wrapped tight, lantern in hand. The cries led them to the barn. At first they thought it might have been an animal, an injured calf maybe. But when they opened the door, they found a girl huddled in the straw, no more than 7. Her dress was torn, her face red from cold, and she clutched something tight to her chest. Silas dropped to one knee. "You alone?" he asked gently. The girl nodded, too scared to speak. "Where's your family?" Etta asked. The girl blinked, tears spilling. "Gone," she whispered. They brought her inside, gave her warm broth, a blanket, and space to sit by the fire. She didn't say much that first night, just stared into the flames as if they held answers she couldn't speak aloud. Her name was Liddy. She had wandered for 2 days after her parents. Wagon was attacked by men who didn't care what they left behind. She'd hidden, waited, then walked. When she saw the chimney smoke from Silas's home, she followed it, crawling the last stretch. Etta didn't sleep that night. She sat by Liddy's bedroll near the hearth, smoothing her hair until the girl finally fell asleep. In the morning, Silas asked no questions. He simply added another chair to the kitchen table and made enough oats for 3. The days repeated. Liddy stayed, they didn't make her leave. And slowly, the house stretched again to make space for a child. Etta braided her hair each morning. Silas carved her a small wooden horse. They taught her how to help with the chickens, how to heat tea, how to read simple words from one of the books Silas kept on the shelf. There was laughter now, real, unforced. But not everyone liked that. One afternoon, a man arrived at the ranch. Sheriff Amos. Tall, with a gray beard, and a badge that never sat quite right on his coat. "I heard you took in a girl," he said, voice rough from tobacco and wind. Silas stood on the porch, arms crossed. "She was freezing in our barn. And you didn't think to report it." "She wasn't a criminal." "That's not the point," Amos said, stepping closer. "There's a system. Orphans get processed through town, put in homes." "Or sold," Etta said quietly from the doorway. Amos turned to her, face tightening. "Watch your mouth." Silas took one step forward. "She's not going anywhere." "That's not your call." Silas didn't flinch. "It is now." There was a pause, tension so thick even the wind stopped. Amos eyed the blind man standing tall, the woman behind him, and the small figure peeking from the window inside. He spat into the snow and stepped back. "I'll be back in 2 days," he said, "with papers." And then he left. That night the fire burned low. Liddy curled against Etta's side, too scared to ask what it meant. Silas stared at the flames. "They'll come back, might try to take her." Etta's voice cracked. "We can't let them." He nodded. "Then we won't." But the next day brought another storm, this time not of snow but men. Amos returned with 2 riders, pistols at their sides, and a wagon ready. "We're here for the girl," he said. Silas stood alone in the yard, cane at his side, breath curling in the morning air. "She's not going," he said. "Don't make this harder." "I'm not making anything, you are." The sheriff stepped forward. "You gonna stop us?" A blind man with a pitchfork. Silas smiled softly. "You'd be surprised what I've got." Then came a sound none of them expected. Voices. Behind the barn, on horseback, came 3 men, ranchers who owed Silas favors, neighbors who hadn't forgotten how he'd helped during dry seasons, shared his tools, or delivered calves in the dead of night. They didn't carry guns, they didn't raise fists. But they stood behind him, one by one, until Amos looked around and saw that he was outnumbered not by strength, but by loyalty. "She's not your daughter," he growled. Silas's voice was quiet, firm. "No, but she's ours now." Amos swore under his breath and turned. The wagon rolled away. Inside the house, Etta hugged Liddy close, tears running freely. When Silas stepped back into the house, his face red from the cold, she kissed his cheek without thinking. And when he turned to her, eyes still dim but slowly clearer, he said the words he hadn't dared speak before. I want this. Etta blinked. What? This house full, this table set, Liddy's laugh in the mornings, you reading to me at night. Her breath caught Sela's. I don't want you to stay as a guest or a helper. I want you to stay as family. Etta said nothing. She crossed the room, took his hand and placed it against her cheek. I've wanted that since the night you opened your door. He leaned in then, and the kiss was soft, tentative and certain all at once. Liddy clapped from behind the corner. They laughed. The snow still fell outside, but inside a family had taken root. Not one born of blood, but of choice, of love, and of second chances. The wind howled like an old memory, clawing at the windows, but the house held strong. It wasn't just timber and nails anymore. It was something else now, something warmer, softer, something built from the breath of second chances and laughter that once seemed impossible. The days after Amos left turned quietly golden. The threat had passed, but none of them moved like it was over. Not really. They still stepped lightly, still looked over their shoulders sometimes. But Liddy laughed again. That made all the difference. She began sleeping through the night, no longer startled awake by dreams of shadows and gunfire. She helped Etta with the washing, told Sela's silly stories as he carved new shapes into wood, and hummed to herself when the sun hit the windows just right. Her voice was small but bright, hopeful. It cracked sometimes when she tried to sing louder, but Sela's told her the cracks were where the light got in. Etta had never been a mother. Not in the traditional sense. She had held life inside her once, a long time ago, but it had slipped away before she could give it a name, before she could give it a home. For years after, she'd spoken to that silence in her belly, that ache no one else saw. And now, here, in this old ranch with a blind man and a broken girl, she found herself humming lullabies as she braided little fingers of Liddy's hair. And Sela's, he changed too. His sight didn't return fully. Shadows sharpened and light moved more clearly, but he still relied on memory and touch and voices. Still tilted his head when she walked into the room, but his steps were steady now, his hands sure. He fixed a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink, tightened the hinges on the front door, and replaced the cracked pane in the barn's loft window. He smiled more, not because he wasn't grieving anymore, but because the grief had made room for something else. He loved them, Etta and Liddy. Not in a loud way, not in the manner of grand declarations or sweeping gestures, but in the way he stirred the fire before dawn so the house would be warm when they woke. In the way he cut a second slice of cornbread before Etta could ask. In the way he leaned toward Liddy's voice as she read to him from the Bible, her little finger tracing each word. One morning, as snow melted into patches of dirt and grass, Sela stood on the porch. The wind had a different taste, wet, promising, smelling of earth and thaw, spring, a season he used to dread because it meant another year alone. Now he waited for Etta to step out beside him. When she did, wrapped in his old coat, her eyes still puffy with sleep, he took her hand and placed something in her palm. A wooden ring. Simple, smooth, carved from the same tree that shaded his father's grave. She blinked. Sela's. I can't give you a church, he said. Can't give you flowers or candles or a preacher's blessing, but I can give you my name, my land, my home, what's left of my heart. Etta stared at him, speechless. Then she nodded. Not once but twice. And then she kissed him, there on the porch, with the wind curling around them like a prayer whispered by the land itself. They didn't call it a wedding, didn't dress up or invite neighbors. They just told Liddy over breakfast, and she clapped so hard she knocked over her mug. That night, Etta and Sela sat in the rocking chairs by the fire, hands twined together, while Liddy lay curled up with her head in Etta's lap. She'd fallen asleep mid-story, the Bible open to a page with her bookmark tucked in carefully. Outside, the moon rose like it knew it was lighting something sacred. But peace in stories like these, never comes without its testing. One afternoon, Etta went to town for flour and sugar. She was alone. Silas had twisted his ankle that morning while mending a fence, and Liddy had fallen asleep in the loft with a kitten she'd named Moses curled on her chest. Etta didn't like town, never had, too many eyes, too much silence filled with judgment. She kept her head down, paid for her goods, and was nearly at her wagon when she heard the voice. "You're the one who took in that girl." The voice was low, slick with disdain. She turned to find a woman, middle-aged, with a pinched face and a Bible held tight like a weapon. "She should have been placed in the care of the proper church channels," the woman said. "You're encouraging sin, harboring an orphan that's not even yours, and that man, he's blind. What kind of home can he provide?" Etta didn't respond, just tied down the sack of flour. "You're barren," the woman spat, voice louder now. "You think pity makes you a mother. That child will grow up wrong under people like you." Etta looked up then, eyes steel. "No, she'll grow up loved." She climbed onto the wagon, turned the reins, and left. The words lingered, though. She didn't speak of them that night, not to Silas, not to Liddy, but they stayed with her like a splinter under the skin. Until one morning, when Liddy found her sitting alone in the barn. "Why are you crying?" the girl asked. Etta wiped her cheek. "Just, some folks think we don't belong together, that I can't be your mother." Liddy crossed the straw, small hands grabbing Etta's sleeves. "But you are." She said it so simply, so surely, that it broke something wide open. Later that week, Silas found Etta at the table, pen in hand, writing on rough parchment. He asked what it was. She handed it to him. A letter to the town's church. A formal request for adoption. A declaration of her intent to make Liddy her daughter, by law, by faith, by heart. The preacher read it twice when she handed it over. "You're certain?" he asked. Etta nodded. "We've been a family long before paper, but I want her to know it can't be taken from her, not by storm, not by men, not by anyone." The process took weeks. Background checks, visits, questions that made Etta feel like she was being dissected, but she endured it, for Liddy, for Silas. On the morning the papers were signed, Liddy wore a yellow ribbon in her hair. She clutched Silas's hand in one of hers, Etta's in the other. They didn't throw a celebration, but that night they lit a candle, shared a meal of stew and cornbread, and Liddy placed the parchment on the mantel like it was scripture. "This means I'm yours," she whispered to Silas. He touched her hair. "You always were." And to Etta, Liddy whispered, "Thank you for finding me." Etta kissed her forehead. "No, little one, thank you for letting me be found." Outside, the stars blinked into view. Inside, a family, scarred but whole, pressed closer to the fire. Spring thickened into summer, the kind that hummed with bees and smelled of sun-warmed wood. The ranch grew soft around the edges, grass high near the fence lines, flowers blooming where no one had planted them. The world, it seemed, was taking its first deep breath in a long while, and within that breath, the home Silas and Etta had built didn't just survive, it bloomed. It began in the soil. Silas, with his sharpened shadows and dulled eyesight, found new purpose in the land again. He tilled the earth with his hands, followed the gentle tug of Liddy's small fingers guiding him to rows marked with string and stakes. They planted beans, squash, and corn. Liddy insisted on pumpkins, even if it wasn't the season. When Etta teased her about that, the girl just smiled and said, "Hope don't follow calendars." The chickens started laying again. The old cow gave more milk than she had in years. Etta laughed, saying even the animals seemed to sense there was something worth living for again. But it wasn't just the work or the crops. It was in the quiet moments between, when Silas played the harmonica at dusk, and Liddy danced barefoot in the dust, or when Etta taught her how to mend a tear in a dress with patient fingers. It was the way they waited for one another before meals, the way their silence together was never awkward but full. Still, the past has a way of circling back, like a hawk watching from the sky. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the east. Etta read it at the table, lips pressed into a thin line. Liddy was feeding scraps to the chickens, and Silas was chopping firewood just outside. The envelope was addressed in a sharp, masculine script she didn't recognize, but the seal bore the mark of a law office. The words inside were stiff, legal, and final. Liddy's grandfather, her mother's estranged father, had learned of her existence. He was wealthy, childless, and suddenly interested in custody. The letter cited bloodline, inheritance, and responsibility. It requested a meeting, not a demand, yet, but close. When Silas stepped inside, wiping sweat from his brow, Etta handed him the letter in silence. His brow furrowed as he ran his fingers over the embossed ink, listening to her voice read each line aloud. When she finished, they sat still. "Do we tell her?" she asked quietly. Silas leaned forward, elbows on the table. "We don't lie, we've never lied to her." So they told Liddy that evening. The girl listened without blinking. When Etta reached out, Liddy didn't pull away, but she didn't speak either. Just stood there, shoulders small, eyes wide, like the world had tilted again, and she wasn't sure if it would stop. "Do I have to go?" she asked finally, her voice a whisper. "No," Silas said immediately. "Not unless you want to." She thought for a long while. He didn't come when Mama died. He didn't come when I was starving. Why now? Neither Etta nor Silas had an answer. The days that followed were heavy with waiting. The lawyer arrived in a black coach, dust trailing behind him like a serpent. He wore a coat too fine for the heat, shoes polished to a mirror shine. His eyes moved too quickly, his handshake too firm. He didn't even look at Liddy when he spoke. "My client is prepared to offer significant compensation," he told Silas and Etta. "She'll be raised in comfort, private tutors, inheritance, travel." Liddy stood behind the doorframe, listening. "She won't have to work," he added. "She won't want for anything." Silas said nothing for a long time. When he finally did speak, his voice was soft. "Except love." The lawyer blinked. "Love," Silas repeated. "Family, belonging, things you can't buy. My client is her blood, and we are her heart." The lawyer left with a polite nod and no promise, said he'd return with papers. "This can be settled amicably," he added, though the word settled felt more like a threat. That night Liddy cried. Etta held her close, whispered scripture into her hair, words about mountains moving and mustard seeds. Silas sat by the fire, harmonica untouched in his lap, staring into the flames like they held answers he couldn't find in words. The next morning, Etta went to town. She didn't say where, didn't take the wagon, just walked with purpose, leaving before the sun rose. She returned hours later, a thin stack of papers clutched in her hand and dirt on her hem. "Marriage," Silas said, brow raised when she handed them to him. "Legal guardianship," she corrected, "signed by the preacher, witnessed, official." Her eyes glinted. "It may not be a bloodline, but it's binding, and I registered her last name as ours." Silas stared at the paper a long time. "Etta Maynard," Liddy whispered that night. "That's my name now." Etta knelt before her. "Only if you want it to be." "I want it," the girl said, clutching the parchment to her chest like it was a shield. The lawyer came back 2 days later. This time he didn't step inside. "I suggest you speak to your client," Etta said coldly. "We've filed guardianship. Any further attempt will go through the courts." He tipped his hat. "Then we'll see you in court." But they never did. Weeks passed, then months. No letters came. No coach returned. Whatever desire that man had to lay claim to a girl he'd never met must have faded in the face of paperwork and backbone. And in time, the threat faded into memory. Fall arrived on the heels of a gentle rain. Liddy's pumpkins, planted out of season, miraculously took root and began to grow. She called it a miracle, Etta agreed. One evening, as leaves danced across the porch and the fire crackled in the hearth, Liddy pulled a small journal from beneath her pillow. "I'm writing my story," she said. "Oh," Etta asked, "what's it called?" Liddy smiled. "Not yet." They didn't understand at first. So she explained. "That day," she said softly, "the day I was digging, I thought it was the end, I really did, and then he came, Silas, and he took the shovel and said those words. Not yet. It was like someone blew breath back into me, like God himself pressed pause on death." Etta brushed a tear from her cheek. "I think," Liddy whispered, "I want to tell the whole story, so nobody forgets, so nobody else feels as alone as I did." "You won't be alone again," Silas said quietly. "Not ever." And she was. The ranch weathered the years, children grew, lines deepened, but the laughter never left, the love never thinned. Liddy never stopped writing. She finished the journal years later, bound it in cloth, and tucked it onto a shelf beside the Bible. She read it aloud sometimes to new faces, orphans passing through, widows seeking refuge, men looking to make peace with their past. And always she ended it the same way. With the story of a shovel, a grave that never filled, and 3 words that changed everything. Not yet.